they wrote letters to hospitals and clinics, particularly Veterans Administration clinics, and told them, quite frankly, we have this new drug. It's called LSD. It's developed in Switzerland. It's psychoactive. What we want to do is send the drug to you, and you'll advertise in the newspaper, and you'll tell people exactly what it is. And you can pay these volunteers with money that we will supply you. And all you have to do is write down a protocol of how they behave, and we'll pay you for all of this. So almost overnight, a huge market grew up for this nice money-making proposition, and a number of hospitals around the country signed up, and people came in for what wound up being the world's first LSD experiments. And so who were they? Well, among the very first people that signed up for a test was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who later went on to become like a high priest of LSD. And one of the other earliest ones was Ken Kesey, who went on to write the great counterculture Bible, the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And actually, in researching the book, found an interview where he said, I got the material for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by working in a mental hospital, but that's not the reason that I went to work there. I went to work there because that's where they kept the LSD.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzulo. Our guest today is distinguished journalist and author Stephen Kinzer. A former New York Times correspondent and bureau chief, he's with us to talk about his book, Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA's Search for Mind Control. As head of the CIA's MK Ultra Mind Control project, which ran from the 50s into the 70s, Sidney Gottlieb directed brutal experiments at secret prisons on 3 continents, making pills, powders, and potions that could kill or maim without a trace, including some intended for Fidel Castro and other foreign leaders. He paid prostitutes to lure clients to CIA-run bordellos, where they were secretly dosed with mind-altering drugs. His experiments spread LSD across the United States and throughout the 1960s counterculture. Gottlieb's reckless experiments on human subjects destroyed many lives. For years, he was the chief supplier of spy tools used by CIA officers around the world. Stephen Kinzer is with us today to talk about his groundbreaking book and the mysterious and sinister Sidney Gottlieb. It's my great honor to welcome Stephen Kinzer as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzulo.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you became interested in this subject?
I can tell you, I've written 10 books. This last one, Poisoner in Chief, is my 10th book.
Mm-hmm.
I've written a lot about stories regarding America's role in the world that have shocked a lot of people. And some of what I discovered really surprised me too.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the first time that I have been truly shocked. I still can't wrap my mind around the story that is in the book that I wrote. I can't believe there was such a person as Sidney Gottlieb and such a project as MK Ultra, even having immersed myself in it for so long. So writing this book was quite a, I would say, a wearing emotional experience.
Mm-hmm.
I was locking myself in a small room, essentially, with this guy, Sidney Gottlieb, for a couple of years. And it was a very intense relationship. It's not like you're writing about a movie star or a pop singer. It's very wearing because some of the things that he did were so horrific.
Horrific, absolutely horrific and shocking.
So as for my own background, how did I get here? I've always been interested in America's connection to the outside world. And a lot of this motivated my main career, which was as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
I was with the New York Times for more than 20 years, mostly posted abroad. I covered wars in Central America. I covered the reunification of Germany and the emergence of post-communist Europe, plus wars in Yugoslavia. Then I became the first Istanbul correspondent of the New York Times, and I covered Turkey and Central Asia and the Caucasus.
Mm-hmm.
This experience has shown me that what we see regarding international relations is not the real story. There's always something behind the curtain.
Right.
And I've tried to devote myself, both in my New York Times reporting and then later on in my present career as a professor and a writer, to trying to look behind the curtain.
Yeah.
What's going on back there?
Yeah, a lot.
I still remember a story I heard from an old patriarch in Nicaragua in the old days. Now, this guy was probably the most brilliant person in Nicaragua. He had a long career, but he never wanted to go into government.
Yeah.
Somoza, the dictator, had invited him to be in the cabinet. After Somoza was overthrown by the Sandinistas invited him to be in the cabinet. Then, after they left and Violeta Chamorro came in, she asked him to be in the cabinet. He never wanted to enter. Everybody wanted him. Then, years later, when he was really quite advanced in age, he suddenly turned up to accept the post of foreign minister. And I said to him, why at this point did you do such a thing? And he said, I walked by the bordello so many times, and I always wonder what has happening inside there. And finally, I decided to go in. And I'm feeling like a little bit like that in my reporting. I'd like to go out and see what is the story behind the story. I'm always looking for a story that is really big and important, but that for some reason we don't know about. It's slipped between the cracks of history.
Yeah.
That's why I wrote a book about the 1953 coup in Iran,
Yeah.
a book about the 1954 coup in Guatemala. And so I've tried to recover great stories that were hugely impactful, but have never been told. And that's what led me to write Poisoner in Chief.
Beautifully put. I think we have a lot in common. I never met you in Nicaragua, but I'm sure you knew my father, who was ambassador there in 1979 through 81, I think.
I certainly do. I remember him vividly. I can picture him at this moment. He went on to become the head of Caritas, I believe.
CRS, yeah.
Yeah.
The Catholic Relief Service, that's right.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
he had quite the job of going to Somoza and saying to him, you're fired.
I know. Talk about things going on behind the scene. I think there was a lot more going on behind the scenes than he realized at the time and later discovered.
Interesting.
So let's talk about Sidney Gottlieb, because what an incredible character. And as you say, the things he got into are extremely troubling and shocking, given sort of what we're told about our foreign policy team and our objectives around the world, and how we are different, morally superior than other countries. Maybe you could start with Operation Paperclip, which is where they recruited some of these people. And, what was Sidney Gottlieb's background and how this whole thing got started right after the Second World War?
So the project that Sidney Gottlieb ran, MK Ultra, was the CIA's search for mind control.
Yeah.
They came up with the conclusion, which I'm sure is correct, that if you could master the secret of mind control, the prize would be nothing less than global mastery.
Mm-hmm.
So then the next step came after they'd had probably generations of cultural exposure to this idea of hypnotism and putting a pill into somebody's drink, all the movies and the stories about that. A couple of things happened that led the American security apparatus to believe that communist powers were developing or had developed the key to mind control.
Mm-hmm.
So what were those two things? First happened in Europe. It was the trial of the Hungarian cardinal, Mindszenty.
Mm-hmm.
This guy was arrested by the communist authorities, held in jail for an extended period. and finally put on trial in a show trial where he confessed to crimes that he obviously hadn't committed. It was obvious to the world that he'd been beaten or coerced into doing this. But in the American security apparatus, they leaped to another conclusion. They looked at the way his eyes were glazed and the way that he spoke in a kind of a monotone. It later turned out that he had been abused in the same way torturers have been abusing prisoners for centuries. But that's not the way the Americans took it. They thought somehow this guy's being controlled from somewhere else. And that means the communists have found out a way to penetrate and take control of a person's mind. And we've got to get on the case.
Yeah.
And then it was a little later that American prisoners of war came home from Korea. Some of them, it turned out, had signed statements denouncing the United States, including racism back in the United States. Some had signed statements admitting that they committed war crimes in Korea, including germ warfare, which the United States always denied that it used. And so the idea then developed in the American security apparatus and at the CIA that somehow these people had been drugged, that their minds had been seized, possibly on a train ride while they were being repatriated across northern China, which is known as Manchuria. And that's where we get that phrase, the Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah.
So it turned out also that there was nothing to that story.
Yeah.
But at the time, the CIA seized on these pieces of evidence that it misinterpreted as meaning that communist powers had discovered or were on the brink of discovering the power of mind control. That meant we were in mortal danger. That meant that no sacrifice could be too great. And we needed to plunge into this project without any boundaries.
Yeah.
And they found a person to run the project. It became known as MK Ultra because Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, then recognized it as the Ultra Challenge, as it was. Now, they fantasized that there was such a thing as mind control. But if you could accept that fallacy, you'd have to accept their next conclusion, that this would be a fantastic thing to have. So Sidney Gottlieb became the person under whose purview all the government's scattered investigations into the techniques of mind control were consolidated.
Mm-hmm.
He was the person who conceived of and directed MK Ultra, and he did it almost without any supervision. I think this was intentional.
Yeah.
It was so that I think the people above him at the CIA, Allen Dulles and Richard Helms, who was his sort of unofficial boss, recognized that whoever was going to run this project was going to have to do some terrible things. There was going to be a lot of blood on the floor. Probably people were going to be killed in secret. And they don't want to know about this.
Yeah.
Knowing the intelligence culture, not only in the CIA, but in other secret services, ignorance is sometimes an asset.
Right.
And they didn't want to know anything that Gottlieb was doing so that if it came out later on, which they feared it might, they could always say, well, one crazy guy went off the rails. And indeed, this is exactly what the CIA wound up saying. It was later on William Colby, the CIA director, who said, some of our people went too far in those days. There was a lack of supervision.
Yeah.
That's exactly what they had planned to say 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
And the idea was, as someone said at the time, let's put it all on Sidney. That way there'd be no institutional responsibility. So Gottlieb spent the 1950s essentially emerging as the most prolific torturer of his generation.
Mm-hmm.
He was, I believe, the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Unless there's someone else who had what was effectively a license to kill issued by the United States government, who could go onto government properties in 3 continents and requisition human beings to be used as subjects in bizarre, extreme experiments that left them disfigured, disoriented, or dead, and then continue doing this kind of work that would lead any normal sociopath into prison with the imprimatur of the United States government. So that to me shows what a huge role he had. The entire project was something he conceived.
Yeah.
It was not something else that was part that anyone else might have done were they in the same job. And it resulted in these terrific, heinous abuses. And he did this all with, again, the imprimatur of the U.S. government. He was an agent and an officer of the U.S. government, and he was engaged in what became the most intense and extreme experiments on human beings that have ever been conducted by anybody in the employ of the U.S. government.
And he brought people into it who had been experts in Japan and Germany in the use of extracting forcibly and using drugs to extract information from people.
Exactly. So Gottlieb approached his new assignment, running the CIA's mind control project, with a scientific approach.
Yeah.
The first thing that he decided he needed to do was to assemble whatever research already existed on the subject. It's a very rational beginning.
Yeah.
So the subject is, how do you destroy a human being? How do you destroy a person's mind and soul and body?
Yeah.
Now, in America, there's very little research on that. For example, how much does it take just as much sarin gas to kill an infant as it does to kill an adult? There's no place you can go in the United States for experimental data on things like that.
Yeah.
But Gottlieb wanted to know, so who's out there? Who's conducted these kinds of extreme experiments? And where did he find them? Among the veterans of the Nazi concentration camps. Those were the people who committed those heinous crimes that were called medical experiments in the concentration camps. And there was another cohort in Japan doing more or less the same thing, in some cases even more extreme.
Yeah,
Than
horrible.
what was going on in the concentration camps in Germany. So Gottlieb brought these people together. And it was under what you referred to earlier as Operation Paperclip. This was the operation by which hundreds of former Nazis were brought into the United States to serve, first of all, to serve in our espionage apparatus, then to serve in our rocket science program, and finally also to serve as advisors in MK Ultra. So they did have people that could tell you the amount of gas that was needed to kill a baby as opposed to an adult, because they had tested all those things.
Yeah.
So when I was writing Poisoner in Chief, I went to Germany to visit a site that was used for MK Ultra experiments. I believe it may be the first ever CIA secret prison. It's a beautiful looking chateau outside of Frankfurt. And I went to visit the building, and I met the guy who was then the new owner. A young German businessman had bought the property, and he was fixing it up. And he offered to take me through. First of all, he told me, everybody in this neighborhood knows what happened in this house. This is not a secret. It's even been the subject of an article in Der Spiegel, the main news magazine, that referred to it as the CIA torture house.
Wow.
So this guy who owned it took me down into the basement where he has storage rooms. And he said to me, these are the rooms where the CIA doctors and their Nazi assistants conducted experiments that were essentially just continuations of the experiments that these Nazi doctors had been performing in the concentration camps just down the road only a few years earlier.
Wow.
And he also told me that the older people who lived in the area said to him that the bodies of people who were experimented to death were buried in the surrounding forest in places that are now covered over by apartment blocks and shopping malls. So it was quite chilling to be sitting in there and then realizing that there's a giant living room with a spectacular fireplace. So they would have been drinking cognac and sitting in a beautiful fire, and down on the basement are these people being tormented.
Operation Paperclip was a secret United States intelligence program in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom were former members and leaders of the Nazi Party, were rescued from Germany and brought to the United States for government employment after the end of World War II. These recruits included notable figures such as Werner von Braun, a leading scientist in rocket technology, Dr. Adolf Bussmann, a leading aeronautic research scientist, Walter Schreibler, who was accused of performing medical experiments on prisoners at Ravensbrück concentration camp, and Dr. Kurt Blum, head of the Nazi biological weapons program. Also given sanctuary in the United States was Japanese general and surgeon Shiro Ishii, who ran Imperial Japan's Biological Warfare Unit 731 and conducted gruesome experiments on men, women, and children.
And the whole purpose of the torture was to find out if by the combination of all kinds of drugs, plus electroshock, plus hypnosis, plus the simultaneous application of sedatives and extreme exciting drugs, you could somehow destroy the mind of a human being. Because this was Gottlieb's second scientific conclusion. First, you find all the scientific studies that are available.
Yeah.
And then your next step should be this. Before you can figure out how to implant a new mind into someone's brain, you must figure out how to destroy the mind that's in there.
Yeah.
So before we can get to phase 2 of implanting a new brain, let's figure out how do we destroy a brain. And that's what a lot of these experiments were aimed at doing. For example, we know very little about the details because Gottlieb and Helms had all the documents destroyed when they left office in the 1970s. But a few have surfaced. Inside the United States, the experiments continued, but they were never as extreme or murderous as they were in other parts of the world. But we do have evidence of one experiment. We have some, but here's one example.
Yeah.
Gottlieb liked to use prisoners inside the United States as his subjects for obvious reasons. They're under the control of the warden and the prison doctor. So we do have a protocol where the prison doctor in the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky, who was a collaborator of Gottlieb's, agreed to an experiment in which he segregated 7 African-American inmates in a cell and fed them what he described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days.
Oh my God.
Now, if the purpose of that experiment was to find out if such a massive overdose could destroy a human mind, that we don't know the answer, but I can guess the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And, we don't know the names of those 7 men. I often wonder, did they ever have the slightest idea what happened to them? No, they were just given this as their regular water. What must they have thought? What could have been the after effects? These are all some of the, even their story is even lesser than the stories of many of the other.
Right, who are buried in the forest in Germany, yeah. And then there's the testimony of the gangster Whitey Bulger, who was in a penitentiary in Atlanta, I believe.
Yes, so one of the few ways we have of reconstructing some of these experiments is by the recollections of some of the victims, who only later understood what had happened to them. And Whitey Bulger, the famous gangster, does turn up to be one of these people. So he was arrested as a small-time thug. He was a car hijacker or a truck hijacker in Boston, and he was sent to the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. The doctor there was a close collaborator of Gottlieb. Now, of course, nobody knew this, but this guy was very enthusiastic about LSD experiments, which was one of Gottlieb's obsessions.
Yeah.
So this doctor persuaded Whitey Bulger to start taking a drug which he said was being tested as a possible cure for schizophrenia. But he wrote that the things were so terrible. This thing they gave me, I was having nightmares. The clock was jumping off the wall. I was feeling bugs all over me. I couldn't sleep. I told him I wanted to stop, even though he was getting extra privileges for doing it. And the doctor kept saying to me, "You're one of our best patients. We could be on the brink of a medical breakthrough. You've got to continue doing this." So I did it. And he had a diary, and he wrote I committed a crime to go to jail, but I think a greater crime was committed on me.
Yeah.
And the effects of this never left him his whole life. And this is not a guy who was a little pansy or an easy.
Right. He's a tough guy. Yeah.
And interestingly enough, I figured out these details as I was writing Poisoner in Chief. Later in life, in the 1970s, so 20 years later, comes out the first information about MK Ultra, that it existed, that some of these things had happened. And there was a reference in the Atlanta newspaper to the fact that this Atlanta doctor was one of their collaborators. And Whitey Bulger recognized, he knew that was his doctor.
Wow.
And then it all came together that he had been one of the subjects of these bizarre experiments. And he told his gangster friends in Boston, "I'm going to go down to Georgia and I'm going to kill that guy." Now, as far as we know, he didn't do that, but that's the way he felt about it. And I'm sure if other MK Ultra victims had ever been able to live long enough to identify Gottlieb, they might have felt the same way.
Yeah. And it seems as though he developed sort of a network of doctors in Canada and across the United States who were either on the payroll or associated with the same kinds of experiments.
You're right. Gottlieb did work with prison doctors and also with ordinary psychiatrists.
Yeah.
We now know of psychiatrists who would get a patient who was coming in for a fairly normal or run-of-the-mill depression or postpartum unhappiness or something like this, and then they would grab this person.
Yeah.
And they would tell them they need all these kinds of drugs, and that person would become an unwitting victim of one of these nefarious doctors who was presumably writing the protocols of the experiment and sending them back to Gottlieb's office. This happened in places across the United States and, as you mentioned, in Canada. Now, not all of these medical personnel were aware of who they were working for.
Yeah.
Some had a pretty clear idea, like the guy in Atlanta,
Right.
the guy in Lexington, Kentucky.
Yeah.
But Gottlieb also had another project besides the coercive use of drugs. He wanted to find out more about the drug that interested him the most, which was LSD.
Yeah.
So he was certainly the first LSD maven. He was obsessed. He was fascinated that there could be a drug with this. So it was odorless, colorless, but so effective in such small doses. He thought that it might be, as one of his fellow scientists wrote, the key that could unlock the universe.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the real truth drug, the drug that would allow you to get into somebody's mind.
Yeah.
So he used a lot of it in these grotesque experiments, but he also wanted to know how does it affect ordinary people in a clinical setting?
Yeah.
So, in 1951, Sidney Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD, which it did. The company that manufactured it in Switzerland wanted to get rid of it anyway.
Yeah.
So they had an eager buyer. So the CIA became, at one point, the total owner of the world's LSD supply.
Yeah.
And as I said, some of this was parceled out to individual psychiatrists. Some went to these horrific experiments. But Gottlieb also had this interest in using it in clinical experiments.
Mm-hmm.
But the CIA does not own, of course, clinical facilities. So what does it do? What does it do? Gottlieb established a couple of bogus medical foundations. They wrote letters to hospitals and clinics, particularly Veterans Administration clinics, and told them, quite frankly, we have this new drug. It's called LSD. It's developed in Switzerland. It's psychoactive. What we want to do is send the drug to you, and you'll advertise in the newspaper, and you'll tell people exactly what it is. And you can pay these volunteers with money that we will supply you.
Yeah.
And all you have to do is write down a protocol of how they behave, and we'll pay you for all of this. So almost overnight, a huge market grew up for this nice money-making proposition, and a number of hospitals around the country signed up, and people came in for what wound up being the world's first LSD experiments. And so who were they? Well, among the very first people that signed up for a test was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who later went on to become like a high priest of LSD.
Yeah.
One of the other earliest ones was Ken Kesey, who went on to write the great counterculture Bible, The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah.
And actually, in researching the book, found an interview where he said, I got the material for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by working in a mental hospital, but that's not the reason that I went to work there. I went to work there because that's where they kept the LSD in the pharmacy. And I wanted to get the key so I could steal the LSD and bring it home to all my friends, which is what I did.
Crazy.
Another guy who came in at the very beginning was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He loved the LSD. He brought all the other Grateful Dead guys, and then they brought the LSD home. So Sidney Gottlieb was actually the conduit through which he leaked out into the American mainstream.
Yeah.
The irony, of course, being that the drug that the CIA hoped would give it the power to rule the world wound up instead fueling countercultural generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for.
Yeah.
When I was researching this book, I saw an interview with John Lennon, and he was asked about LSD, and he said, we must always remember to thank the CIA.
Wow.
Now, he was right. Now, if he had known the whole story, if he had known what I was able to discover decades later, he would have said, we must always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb.
Yeah.
Because he was the guy who brought LSD into the United States and then set up the experiments through which it leaked out into the world.
And was basically distributing it throughout, like the artistic center, prisoners, and the artistic community. And that way it sort of became popularized and spread, throughout the rebellious youth of the 60s.
Absolutely. Even before LSD became a drug of choice for deadheads and hippies, by the late 50s, it was already sought after in chic, exclusive New York circles where Claire Booth Luce would take LSD. Cary Grant, famous.
Cary Grant, yeah.
So it was, for a time, it became kind of an in drug for the elite.
Yeah.
And then they, like the masses always do, they ruined it for the elite.
Right. Yeah, and he had actual clinics he was supporting in San Francisco and in Greenwich Village, which were sort of the focal points of sort of these artistic undergrounds that were developing, and run by this guy who just sounds very sinister, George Hunter White.
Yeah.
Can you talk about him for a minute?
The story of MK Ultra leads you through some pretty wild characters.
Yeah.
But I have to think the wildest of all was George Hunter White. So Sidney Gottlieb, as I said, was trying to use all kinds of crazy ways to experiment with people, try to see how they responded to various kinds of drugs. He had established a base in New York City where a guy posing as a seaman or someone would bring people into his apartment and drug them so that his reactions could be seen. But Gottlieb wanted to systematize this. So he decided to move his operation to San Francisco. And there he would establish a full-scale bordello. And so he would want to have girls working for him who would pick up men, bring them back to this apartment, and then dose them with whatever drug Gottlieb wanted to test that week.
Yeah.
So he needed somebody to run this operation. And the guy that he chose was the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration unit in San Francisco, a guy named George Hunter White, who was former counterintelligence officer in Korea, very, by his own standard, by his own acclaim, used to beating people up and carried at least one murder in some agent in India on his record. Short, squat, once described as, because he was bald, looking like a very lethal bowling ball. Anyway, this guy was the scourge of drug users in San Francisco. He was always setting up people. He was interested in persecuting jazz musicians or anybody that he could find using drugs. But he himself was also a heavy drug user. He used every drug that was available so he could find out what it was. Anyway, living right on the edge of the law and living so wild as he did, he was the ideal choice for Sidney Gottlieb.
Yeah.
So Gottlieb approached him and asked him to be what amounted to, he called it a consultant to the CIA. His job was going to be set up the whorehouse in San Francisco. And this guy knew all the girls who were in the business because he was arresting them all the time.
Yeah.
And so this drug agent became a CIA contract employee and ran what became known as Operation Midnight Climax. That was the operation by which prostitutes working for the CIA brought men up to an apartment where this fat drug agent, George Hunter White, would sit behind a one-way mirror on his portable toilet, drinking martinis out of a pitcher and observing the action and taking notes.
Yeah.
Well, this was no science. There was no psychologist in it. There was no one who could interpret this.
No, it's just like perversion, actually. Yeah.
So, but Gottlieb kept this experiment going. And later on, I discovered something that made me think that maybe there was a personal motive behind all this. So one of the things I found as I was researching my book, Poisoner in Chief, was that there had been a lawsuit launched against Gottlieb much later in life, and there had been depositions taken. And I found the lawyer who was well into his 90s. And yeah, he remembered the case. He'd had it for years, and he had some boxes out in his garage. This is the way these things always work. Anyway, to make a long story short, I found a deposition by one of the guys who was actually the assistant to George Hunter White in running this Operation Midnight Climax.
Wow.
And he was very talkative
Yeah.
in the deposition, which I love.
Yeah.
In fact, he's in one of his depositions, he says, I said to Sidney Gottlieb, we're two Jewish guys from Brooklyn. How the hell did we ever get involved in this? Anyway, in this deposition, the guy says, every time Sidney came out to San Francisco to look at our operation, which was pretty frequently, he always had me set him up with the girls.
Yeah.
Always, as soon as he got there, he wanted to get with one of the girls.
Yeah.
I thought this was a little quirk, but then later on I began to think, put yourself in the mindset of a middle-aged guy.
Yeah.
He's got a family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here now he suddenly has under his own control a stable of women that he can just go out and see on business. Of course, it's strictly business.
Yeah.
So maybe the reason that he kept that operation going and will monitor it so enthusiastically had a little bit to do with things that were beyond the purview of MK Ultra itself. Personal motives play
well, as you say, it was totally unsupervised, and so he was able to do this stuff. I mean, it almost sounds like a precursor to Jeffrey Epstein in a way.
He didn't share them with other people. He just kept all the favors.
In your research, did you ever uncover what kind of budget was he working with? Because, this was sort of like a pretty far-flung operation with clinics and safe houses and distributing LSD and so on. Or was all that information destroyed?
All that information was destroyed. However, although I couldn't speculate on numbers, I can guess now.
Yeah,
as common sense. As journalists, we're trained not to do that until you have sources, but we'll have no sources. So I'll do something here that I never do in my books, which is speculate.
Yeah.
My books are strictly the facts.
Right.
So I would imagine that Gottlieb was told, we didn't call this project Ultra from nothing.
Yeah.
Ultra means it's the most important thing in the universe.
Yeah.
So whatever you need, you just send us the bill.
Yeah.
I'm sure they told him, if they've told him, listen, you can requisition prisoners in Japan or in Korea or in Germany and kill as many as you want.
Yeah.
certainly would be reasonable to say, and by the way, if it costs a lot of money, whatever you need, just invoice it to us.
And it also begs the question, what role did the CIA play? How deep a role did they play in the explosion of LSD use among youth in our country in the 60s?
That's probably a question that has a lot of sides to it, and we don't know many of them. All I could say for sure is that it's no doubt that it was through clinics that offered ordinary citizens the chance to come in and try LSD, that LSD became popular among counterculture types, beginning in California.
Mm-hmm.
Now, probably the people who ran those clinics did not know that the Macy Foundation was actually the CIA.
Yeah.
They would have no reason to ask.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe they didn't want to know.
Well, and in those days, there was a whole different perception of our intelligence community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if they suspected, they certainly wouldn't want to ask. In fact, that would be just another reason not to ask.
Right.
Nonetheless, at the very minimum, it was the LSD that the CIA brought into the United States that Allen Ginsberg and Robert Hunter and Ken Kesey swallowed. Those first trips were pure property. The LSD was the pure property of the US government, and specifically the CIA, because at that time, nobody else had it.
Yeah.
The CIA owned the entire world supply.
And Timothy Leary, who was sort of like the messenger of LSD, he also had an association with this program.
It's a remarkable story. So people associate Tim Leary with LSD, maybe more than any other single person.
Yeah.
Now, Timothy Leary became an LSD convert a little bit later, like towards the end of the 50s and the early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Gottlieb was into it in the early 50s. But here's the Leary connection. It's very interesting. So Tim Leary first became interested in the idea of psychedelic drugs. At the same moment, a number of other people in the United States became interested in it.
In May 1957, Timothy Leary was a lecturer in clinical psychology at Harvard University. Upon reading the article Stephen referred to in Life magazine, Leary traveled to Cuernavaca, Mexico, and consumed psilocybin psychedelic mushrooms for the first time, an experience that he said drastically altered the course of his life. Leary wrote that he, quote, learned more about the brain and its possibilities in the 5 hours after taking these mushrooms than in the preceding 15 years of studying and doing research. Back at Harvard, Leary and some associates began a research project known as the Harvard Psilocybin Project, whose goal was to analyze the effects of psilocybin on human subjects, first prisoners and later students, using a synthesized version of the drug. Beat poet Allen Ginsberg heard about the Harvard Research Project and asked to join, as did Jack Kerouac, jazz musicians Maynard Ferguson and Charles Mingus, and other intellectuals and artists.
And that was when, in the mid-1950s, an article appeared in Life magazine.
Wow.
About a sorceress or a bruja in Oaxaca, Mexico, who used magic mushrooms and would put people into a real psychedelic trance. This article caused a big stir. There were many large photographs, and you saw this woman, Maria Sabina, conducting her rituals. And the author made clear that psychedelic effects are real.
Yeah.
So Timothy Leary became interested and actually went to Mexico to look for those mushrooms. And then after taking the mushrooms, that's what led him on to his interest in how drugs that affected the mind that way could be synthesized, which led him to LSD.
Yeah.
So here's the original connection. The article in Life magazine didn't just appear.
Yeah.
What happened was the CIA had, through Sidney Gottlieb, was already interested in the magic mushrooms of Mexico, just like Sidney Gottlieb collected thousands of Alaskan butter clams to extract tiny amounts of poison from them, or he was getting the gallbladders of a certain kind of crocodile from Africa. He was interested in any kind of poison that was naturally occurring. So Gottlieb would try to introduce these poisons into his own experiments. And as a matter, and this is actually what led to the one time Sidney Gottlieb became known. And it was not for MK Ultra. Later on in the 1970s, after Gottlieb had retired, he was called back to testify in secret to the Senate committee, which horrified him because nobody was even supposed to know that he existed. And the reason was the Senate was investigating the assassination attempts that the CIA made on foreign leaders. And they had determined that Gottlieb was the American poisoner in chief. Whenever the CIA needed poison, he's the one who made it. He was the probably world's greatest expert on poisons. And so he made the poisons that you always read about that they tried to use to kill Castro. The poison pen, the poison pills, all that stuff.
Beard
that was
going to fall powder. His beard was going to fall out.
Then the suicide pills that were given to the U-2 pilots like Gary Powers, all of the pills that were given to CIA officers, agents that were afraid they'd be captured, all those suicide pills, the poison that was used to supposed to kill Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, those were all Gottlieb's. So the investigating committee focused him in on this, and he admitted it because he was testifying under a grant of immunity. And so that's the only thing he ever became known for. But actually, that's not important.
No.
That's just the job of a pharmacist.
That's a sideshow.
Anybody, if another person had that job, they would have made the same poisons.
Right.
During the Senate investigation, nobody pursued the real Gottlieb story. And as I read through those testimonies, I realized, and actually Senator Gary Hart, who was on the committee, I was later in touch with him as I was writing this book, also confirmed this to me, that there was a feeling we shouldn't go there. Some of the Republicans thought it would embarrass the agency too much. And besides, we had to pick and choose, and we decided not to pursue MK Ultra. But intentionally or unintentionally, they missed the big story. They focused on one that sounded exciting at the time, but wasn't really that important.
Because LSD certainly had a much bigger effect domestically than any of these poisons did on, CIA operations abroad. And as you point out in your book, many of them failed. Only a few of them, that, as far as we know, were effective.
The strange thing is that when Gottlieb came under fire within the CIA at the late 50s, people were saying, wait a minute, things are going crazy. We hear terrible stories. And Gottlieb, who was in private he was the compassionate torturer. He was a sweetheart. He was a Zen Buddhist and he studied poetry.
Somebody described him, later in life as like a hippie, like very meditating and living out in the country off the land. And
that got up before dawn to milk his goats. So actually, there's another piece about Gottlieb that I think is interesting to explain his career. So at the end of his period, towards the end of the 50s, when he became a little bit uncomfortable, or the CIA became a little uncomfortable with him, in his Zen way, he not only didn't fight back, but he agreed, you're all right. And it's actually the whole thing, we shouldn't refine it, like you said, we should just end it. And he essentially said, I admit, the result of our experimentation is there is no such thing as mind control. Like LSD, it's too unreliable. He basically tried, we tried it, so it was like, never mind, sorry. And even he conceded that it didn't work. And then he went on to another career at the CIA as the principal maker of devices, all the spy craft, all the stuff that Q used to make for James Bond. That became Sidney Gottlieb in his second life. But I wanted to mention one other aspect about Gottlieb that I think is interesting. It's very interesting that he had this home character, that he was such a nice guy and so compassionate, which is quite bizarre.
It is bizarre.
It's really kind of a Jekyll and Hyde.
Well, they said that about Hitler too. He liked dogs and he
was a vegetarian too. But here's the interesting thing about Gottlieb. So he was hired in the early 50s, in 1951, at a time when the CIA was young and new, and all the senior officers of the CIA were the same type of people. They all knew each other.
Yeah.
They were all silver spoon children of the American aristocracy. They'd gone to the same prep schools. They dated the same girls. They worked in the same law firms on Wall Street or the same investment banks. They sailed in the same yacht clubs. They were on the same golf clubs. So they're all the same types.
Yeah.
So when it comes time to hire another one of their senior people to run MK Ultra, which is their biggest project of all, who do they hire? A guy who's a Jew. He's an immigrant. Parents are immigrants. Grew up in the Bronx. He has a limp and he stutters. He went to Hebrew school. He went to City College. He couldn't have been more different from them.
Yeah.
Now, looking back, I'm thinking that this was not an accident.
Of course not.
It was that they thought at the beginning, we can't have someone who's
part of our club
like us doing these kind of terrible things.
Yeah.
We wouldn't ask that of someone like us to actually be the person next to the blood. We like to be a little bit removed. And also, there's a good possibility that this could explode, or this could be embarrassing, or this could somehow come out. And then we can say, it was that guy, because we have no hesitation at throwing him under the bus.
Right.
He's not one of us.
Yeah.
I think it was intentional that they hired such an unusual person for that job.
Yeah.
And then at the end, when some documents about MK Ultra came out, Gottlieb, it was in the mid-70s, Gottlieb complained at one hearing, still secret, but some pieces of it have been reprinted, that he said there are documents being published from the CIA that are declassified that have about 4 signatures on them, and they're all blotted out except for mine, which is left in. And he was right. So the idea, let's lay it all on Sidney, probably was on their minds.
Yeah, but he was definitely, they knew what he was doing. I mean, he was very close to Alan Dulles, who was gung-ho about this project, and also, as you mentioned, with Richard Helms, who were, two principal, both became directors of the CIA and were very influential throughout their careers.
I would say that those two guys knew, if you had to press them, that Gottlieb was doing terrible things, that a lot of blood was being spilled in the project, that probably people were being killed. But they could honestly say, I don't know of any case in which a person was killed.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Gottlieb never told anybody, and they didn't want to know.
Yeah.
So their claim of ignorance is not without substance. You just have to add that the ignorance was willful.
Right. And definitely part of their operating procedures.
And part of their original plan.
Being able to deny it.
Indeed.
And can you talk about the case of Frank Olson? That's a pretty, it's entered the consciousness of people and was claimed to be a suicide, but very likely was not.
The Frank Olson case is really one of the most bizarre aspects of the history of MK Ultra. So Frank Olson was a chemist who was part of this very small, super secret group that knew everything about MK Ultra. They were the project. But at one point, Olson began to have attacks of conscience.
Yeah. His
job was developing ways to turn poisons into sprays. He was an aerosol expert. So they would have a bunch of monkeys, and he would try to time release with some kind of spray, and then he'd go home. And in the morning, he'd see the whole cage full of dead monkeys, and then our operation was a success.
Yeah.
This bothered him after a while.
Yeah.
And then during one of his visits to England, these MK Ultra scientists used to travel to observe experiments. He watched an experiment that the British associates of MK Ultra carried out, in which a young volunteer died under the kind of substance that Olson himself probably produced. The details aren't clear, but Olson watched a guy die under one of his experiments, possibly through an aerosol that he developed.
Yeah.
And he told the guy who ran the British program, I really don't like this anymore.
Yeah.
I want to leave. I want to leave the CIA, and I want to leave MK Ultra.
Yeah.
And this guy immediately, of course, told the CIA that
Sure.
Olson was talking like this.
Yeah.
Then Olson went home and he told his friend, one of his friends, that he was thinking of leaving the CIA. And he even said to this friend, "Do you know a good journalist?" So MK Ultra was the greatest secret inside the CIA.
Yeah.
If it had been revealed, it would not only have devastated the CIA, it would, at the most intense moment of the Cold War, have destroyed the image of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It was a completely intolerable risk. Putting yourself in Gottlieb's shoes, you can understand that he would have thought this was not something he could live with.
Yeah.
So on a November evening in 1951, in 1953, poor Frank Olson went out the window of a New York City hotel. This was then described in official accounts as the suicide of an Army scientist.
Yeah.
Now, he was not an Army scientist.
Yeah.
He was working for the CIA. And as for it being a suicide, that just became the official version.
Yeah.
And that was the version that lasted for 20 years. Then 20 years later, in the mid-70s, when there were investigations into the CIA, it emerged that at a secret hideaway a few weeks before Olson died, it was a meeting of MK Ultra scientists.
Yeah.
Gottlieb had been fed LSD without his knowledge, possibly with the hope that he would talk or that he would say what he was thinking. And so in any case, then the story changed.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a suicide, but it wasn't just because of general depression. Actually, the CIA might have been responsible because they fed him LSD a week before.
Yeah.
And the family was given a settlement in exchange for dropping all future legal claims. And they were actually received by President Ford, the only time in history that a president of the United States has in person apologized for a CIA action. So then the story was, he committed suicide, but after the CIA gave him this drug that could well have upset him.
Yeah.
Then comes story number 3. Years later, after a memo, what was called an assassination assassination manual emerged in a CIA report. It said that the best way to kill somebody would be to throw him from a high window after hitting him on the head with a heavy object.
Yeah.
This was probably written by Gottlieb.
Yeah.
And so Frank Olson's son went to have his father's body exhumed. Sure enough, there's a very heavy contusion right on his forehead. When you look at that physical evidence, and then, as I said, put yourself in the shoes of people running MK Ultra at that time or running the CIA, and the potential of somebody leaving the reservation, then I think the possibility that there was no suicide at all certainly emerges. And I tell you, to be in that little room, there was one detective.
That's right. You talk about in the book how you go to the hotel room.
And a detective who had actually been on the case at the beginning came back there years later, already retired. And he said, in his later report, he said, according to the so-called witness, who was the number 2 guy in MK Ultra, Frank Olson ran across the room in his socks and dove through the window. He said the window is so narrow, you could barely go through it.
Yeah. And
so it would just make sense that you would crawl over to the window and just crawl out.
Yeah.
There's no reason to make what he called that Superman move and dive through.
Yeah.
So putting all the circumstantial evidence together, you have to say that although it's circumstantial, it's pretty persuasive.
Yeah.
So MK Ultra resulted not only in the deaths of many unknown victims, but one of its own scientists.
Right. And then after Gottlieb retired, he agreed to meet with the family of Frank Olson.
That's right. He
in a bizarre,
trying to be very nice to them, and the son was very perturbed. Still is, actually.
Yeah.
What happened?
Peter.
And he was told by Gottlieb, you should think about therapy for people that have emotional disturbances, because I see this is affecting him. And he said, that's the moment. He told me that's the moment when I realized how skillful a manipulator he was making it seem like it was coming from me.
Yeah. That's pretty sinister.
I would just add this closing remark. So Gottlieb concluded at the end of the 1950s, there's no such thing as mind control.
Yeah.
He probably knew more about mind control than anyone in the world then. And I think he was absolutely right. He tried everything.
Yeah.
But that was at the end of the 1950s.
That's right.
Think of advances in neuroscience, in artificial intelligence, in cyber technology.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if 50 years from now, there's another Stephen Kinzer writing a book about what was happening in the 2010s behind closed doors that no one knew about. So Gottlieb was right at the time. Is there a latter-day Sidney Gottlieb?
As Stephen Kinzer points out in his excellent book, Sidney Gottlieb saw himself as a spiritual person. But that didn't stop him from conducting years of heinous assaults on the lives of others, including feeding mentally handicapped children with cereal laced with uranium and radioactive calcium, or dosing unsuspecting people with dangerous drugs without their knowledge, or working with Nazi scientists who he knew were connected to torture and murder of fellow Jews in concentration camps. But what is more troubling than the twisted moral character of Sidney Gottlieb was the institution, the CIA, and our government that directed and enabled him to conduct such inhuman acts in the name of science and national security. The question was and is, how far are we willing to go to protect ourselves from perceived threats? It's a question we still struggle to answer today, as we sometimes bend the rules of decency to fight wars overseas or force people to take experimental medical treatments in the name of public health. I thank Stephen Kinzer for his important book and for sharing his research and insights into the life and career of former Poisoner-in-Chief Sidney Gottlieb. It's my great honor to name author and journalist Stephen Kinzer as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzulo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Music provided by Extreme Music. For exclusive content, please join our Patreon group at patreon.com/heroesbehindheadlines.